All right, well, I wanted to talk about something that is very interesting regarding the timing of the building of Solomon's temple. And also, I wanted to talk a little bit about something I thought about. I was watching John's video, Watchman for That Great Day, and he was talking about observing the month of Aviv, which is Aviv in Hebrew. And that is when Aviv actually means green ears, that the grain is not quite ripe yet, referring to barley, that it's still green, and yet it's coming pretty soon into a golden color, but it's not quite ripe yet. It's not quite at the golden stage. It's still in the green stage. Something occurred to me about that nobody's really been thinking about, and I'll share that with you in a moment. But when did Solomon commence to build the temple? This is very interesting that I ran into this because I was just looking on a Hebrew calendar trying to detect exactly the month of Aviv or Abib, and Abib became the month of Nisan. So it's March, April. The months kind of go mid-month. The ancient month that follows Aviv is the month Ziv, Z-I-V. And you'll find this very interesting that in 1 Kings 6:1, it says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So he began to build the temple of God in the 2nd month, which would have been the next month after Nisan, or which was originally Aviv. So that is extremely interesting. Is this when Israel will start to build the 3rd temple? In the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, when Solomon began to build the house of the Lord? So according to this Hebrew calendar, it shows you the month of Aviv, which is Nisan. Celebration of Passover is, of course, always the 14th. And you can see that the Jordan River swells at the time that the barley is growing. The very next month is the ancient month of Ziv. And that's the month of Ziv, which is now called Iyar. That is when King Solomon started building the temple of God in the dry season, which begins mostly clear skies. And that has to do with the wheat. Do you realize that Joshua crossed the Jordan River probably when the Jordan was swelling, and God made the water go back so they could cross over? If Solomon started to build the temple in the month of Ziv, the month after Nisan or Aviv, then that would put it in the April-May time frame that he started to build the temple. So will the Jews follow suit and start building the temple in the same month of Ziv or Iyar? That's when the dry season begins. And remember, there is a second Passover that takes place, which is a month after the Aviv Nisan 14th Passover. There's a second opportunity to celebrate the Passover 1 month later on the 14th, which is known as the second Passover or late Passover. So that is very interesting that that occurs at the time that Solomon commenced to build the temple of God, the house of God. And now that makes me wonder about the building of the 3rd temple. if that's when they will start building it. Now let's look at that passage that John was talking about. I believe he was in Deuteronomy, but this one is Exodus 13:4. And there are several translations, so I'll read a couple of them. It says, "Today, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving. On this day in early spring, in the month of Aviv, you have been set free. Today, in the month of Aviv, you are going out. Today, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving. This day came ye out in the month of Aviv. On this day, in the month of Aviv, you are about to go out from here." Amplified says, "On this day, in the month of Aviv, you are about to go onward." The Jewish JPS Tanakh of 1917 says, "This day ye go forth in the month Aviv." Now this is what John was pointing out when his Bible flipped open to this passage, Deuteronomy 16:1. And it says, God was telling the Jews what to do. "Observe the month of Aviv, and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God, for in the month of Aviv the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night." That's pretty much the exact translation of the Tanakh there. Now I just had an incredible thought that nobody's been thinking about. I don't believe anybody's ever mentioned this. It's something that God just put on my heart when I was thinking about this. I thought, people are always trying to figure out according to the calendar when the month of Aviv was in Israel, and they're trying to follow the calendar according to when the barley is in the Aviv state, which is the green ears state, before it becomes ripe. And also, if it's not ripe in the month of Aviv, it is given one more month to get ripe. So it only takes 2 to 3 more weeks for it to become golden in color. What just occurred to me is that they would have been following Egypt and the harvest within Egypt at the time. They were leaving Egypt in the month of Aviv. So, shouldn't we look at when the barley is in Aviv, in Egypt, instead of Israel? Because that's when they were leaving Egypt. So they were observing what God told them about leaving Egypt in that month. They weren't in Israel observing the feast days of the Lord. They weren't even there. And they had never been to the Promised Land. So why are we looking on the calendar for the month of Aviv being in Israel and the timing of the barley harvest in Israel, if it had to do with Aviv in Egypt and the harvest time there and the flooding of the Nile River, which took place, and they had certain crop rotations and certain types of plantings that they did. They had 2 row crops and 6 row crops where they planted the barley. Why has this never occurred to anyone before? It's just something God just put in my spirit about it, and then I was researching about Egypt and its crops. And the Lord also said in Exodus 12:2, "This month is the beginning of months for you. It shall be the first month of your year." So I think John was trying to point out that that may be the timing of when we would be leaving from the world, which is a picture of ancient Egypt, and that we may be leaving in the rapture. So I wanted to reiterate that, but I want to talk about Egypt and the barley. There was a prominent settlement of farmers near the banks of the Nile River. They planted vegetables and cereals like wheat and barley for their livelihood. Barley and wheat were usually cultivated twice a year with the help of an abundance of Nile River's water, as it would flood every year. Now remember, when the Hebrews did flee Egypt, they were calling out to God and crying for the things that used to be grown there. And they were probably growing theirs along the Nile River, the crops, and in ancient Egypt, several vegetables such as onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, cabbage, radish, turnips, legumes, and cucumbers were grown and consumed in a large quantity as traditional food by all classes. They ate fibrous vegetables, rich in vitamins and minerals, along with meat and bread. They considered vegetables essential to the body for good health, as vegetables were a complementary side dish to most meals in Egyptian food. They ate vegetables with most meats and bread as a customary practice. Now, regarding barley, is one of the main and oldest cereal crops on earth. Worldwide, its grain production is ranked fourth over maize, rice, and wheat. Barley is generally considered a poor man's crop because it is easy to cultivate with few requirements and has a high capacity for adaptation to harsh environments. Some literature estimates the age of barley at 11,000 years. However, six-roed barley did not arise until after 6,000 BC. Archaeological evidence has dated barley cultivation to 5,000 to 6,000 BC in Egypt. Barley products, especially bread and beer, comprised a complete diet in ancient Egypt. Now, of course, they had a 3-season crop cycle depending on the Nile River. And the month of Aviv, which is March, April, and in Egypt it would have been March to May, is called the month of Shemu, the harvesting season. The fully grown crops had to be cut down, harvested, and removed before the Nile flooded again. And it was also the time to repair the canals ready for the next flood. So that's March through May in Egypt. In October through February, you had the month of Peret. This is considered the growing season in October. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a layer of rich black soil. This fertile soil was then plowed and seeded in October through February. During the flooding season, which was June to September on the Nile River, was the month of Akhet. No farming was done at this time, from June to September, as all the fields were flooded. Instead, many farmers worked for the pharaoh, building temples or pyramids, and some of the time they spent repairing their tools or looking after animals. So basically, the harvesting season was March through May in Egypt. And that would have been the month of Aviv, Shemu. Now we read that in Egypt and Jericho, the tender green ears of ripe barley still occurs at the same solar time as it did back then, which is around the 1st of March on our calendar. Our March-April is synonymous with the Hebrew month of Aviv, which most scholars agree, and March comes before April. We also find that these accounts are in harmony with the natural history of Egypt. According to Pliny, the barley is reaped in the 6th month after the sowing time, and the wheat in the 7th month. The barley is ripe about the end of February or beginning of March. The wheat at the end of March or beginning of April, and that's an incredibly important statement. I'll read it again just so you get it. The barley is ripe about the end of February or beginning of March. Let me read this excerpt from Ellicott's Commentary for English Readers. The flax and the barley was smitten during the hail plague that happened. Flax was grown largely in Egypt, since linen garments were very generally worn by the people and were the necessary attire of the priests. Mummies also were swathed in linen bandages, and soldiers wore linen corselets. Barley was grown in Egypt as food for horses, as an element in the manufacture of beer, and as a material for an inferior kind of bread. The flax is bold, forms its seed vessel towards the end of January or beginning of February, and the barley comes into ear about the same time. It says these facts fix the date of this plague of hail and help to fix the dates both of the earlier and later ones. Let's look at some of the other comments in Barnes' notes on the Bible. The flax was bold, in blossom. This marks the time. In the north of Egypt, the barley ripens and flax blossoms about the middle of February or at the latest early in March. And both are gathered in before April, when the wheat harvest begins. The cultivation of flax must have been of great importance. Linen was preferred to any material and exclusively used by the priests. It is frequently mentioned on Egyptian monuments. And of course, all the priests in the temple of God in Jerusalem also wore the flax, and that's such a natural fabric that's breathable, so the priests would not sweat and, soil their garments, and they could not approach God in that kind of situation. So linen was the wonderful fabric. And of course, I talked about the linen in Ireland and everything in my book, so I hope you'll read that. And of course, Jesus was wrapped in a linen burial shroud. This commentary, Jameson Fawcett Brown Bible Commentary, says the flax and the barley was smitten. The peculiarities that are mentioned in these cereal products arise from the climate and physical constitution of Egypt. In that country, flax and barley are almost ripe when wheat and rye or spelt are green. And hence the flax must have been bold, that is, risen in stalk or podded in February, thus fixing the particular month when the event took place. Barley ripens about a month earlier than wheat. Flax and barley are generally ripe in March, and then wheat and rye, properly spelt, are ripe in April. Then in Gill's exposition of the entire Bible, it says, "And the flax and the barley was smitten with the hail, thunder, and lightning, and were beat down, bruised, broken, and blasted, and destroyed. Of the former there were great quantities produced in Egypt, which was famous for linen. Much was made there, and there were many that wrought in fine flax." See Isaiah 19:9. "And the latter were used not only to feed their cattle," that's the barley, "but to make a drink of, as we do ale and strong beer. And so the Egyptians use it to this day," as Dr. Shaw says, "both to feed their cattle, and after it is dried and parched, to make a fermented, intoxicating liquor called banza, probably the same with the barley wine of the ancients, and a species of the sikar, or strong drink of the scriptures. For the barley was in the ear, and the flax was bold, or in the stalk, quite grown up, and so the ears of the one were beat off, and the stalks of the other battered with the hail, and broken and destroyed." And he's talking about one of the plagues that took place in Egypt. So that word bold in regards to the flax means that it was in bud. And that word is kind of an obsolete word, bold. And in Ireland, they now say podded, that the flax is podded. Now listen to this one from Pulpit Commentary. "The flax and the barley was smitten during the hail plague. Flax was largely cultivated by the Egyptians, who preferred linen garments to any other, and allowed the priests to wear nothing but linen. Several kinds of flax are mentioned as grown in Egypt. And the neighborhood of Tanis, which is interesting, that's where Jeremiah and some of the princesses of Judah fled, was to Tanis, Egypt, and is expressly said to have been one of the places where the flax was produced. The flax is bold, blossoms towards the end of January or beginning of February, and the barley comes into ear about the same time, being commonly cut in March. Barley was employed largely as the food of horses and was used also for the manufacture of beer, which was a common Egyptian beverage. So surely we are living kind of in an Egyptian environment here, because around Colorado, there's all kinds of breweries, microbreweries, and they're super popular. It says a certain quantity was made by the poorer classes into bread. That's talking about the barley. Let me read this one. Kyle and Delich, Biblical Commentary on the Old Testament. The account of the loss caused by the hail is introduced very appropriately in Exodus 9:31 and Exodus 9:32 to show how much had been lost and how much there was still to lose through continued refusal. The flax and the barley were smitten, for the barley was ear and the flax was blossom. They were neither of them quite ripe. They were in Aviv, which means the green ear. But they were already in ear and blossom, so they were broken and destroyed by the hail. The wheat, on the other hand, and the spelt were not broken down because they were tender or late. They had no ears as yet, and therefore could not be broken by the hail. These accounts are in harmony with the natural history of Egypt. According to Pliny, the barley is reaped in the 6th month after the sowing time, the wheat in the 7th, and I already said that before in another excerpt. The barley is ripe about the end of February or beginning of March. The wheat at the end of March or beginning of April. The flax is in flower at the end of January. In the neighborhood of Alexandria, and therefore quite in the north of Egypt, the spelt is ripe at the end of April, and farther south it's probably somewhat earlier, for according to other accounts, the wheat and spelt ripen at the same time. Consequently, the plague of hail occurred at the end of January, or the latest in the first half of February, so that there were at least 8 weeks between the 7th and 10th plagues. The hail must have smitten the half, therefore, of the most important field produce, the barley, which was a valuable article of food both for men, especially the poorer classes, and cattle, and flax, which was also a very important part of the produce of Egypt, whereas the spelt, of which the Egyptians preferred to make their bread, and the wheat were still spared. So that gives you a time frame. That's really what we should be looking at, is when was Aviv in Egypt? When was the barley in that green state at the time of the plague of the hail, where it was destroyed? And this gives us the idea that the barley is ripe about the end of February or beginning of March. And of course, March, April is the month of NISAN, the month that the Passover 7 days are commemorated and remembered before the Lord. Let me reiterate this. And I typed in, when is barley harvested in Egypt? And it says, in the north of Egypt, the barley ripens and flax blossoms about the middle of February, right about now. Or at the latest, barley ripens either in the middle of February, at the latest early in March, and both are gathered in before April, when the wheat harvest begins. We really need to look at the barley harvest in Egypt And if it coincides with the one in Israel, that's fine, well and good. But that is when God said to observe Aviv, because that's when they left, that's when they were leaving Egypt. So when God said that they were to observe the month of Aviv, they were not in Israel observing those feasts. They were in Egypt. And God told them that they were leaving Egypt in Aviv. So we need to go by exactly when that barley harvest happens in Egypt. And right there, I just told you that about the middle of February, or at the latest in early March, both the flax and barley are gathered in before April. Now let's look at that a little further, that barley was the first crop to ripen in the spring in both Canaan and Egypt. In fact, the Hebrew month of Aviv, green ears, has direct reference to the ripening of barley in that month. On the first day of that month, the priest would inspect a sheaf of barley to see if it had eared out yet. If so, it was announced to all the people that Passover would be observed in Jerusalem 2 weeks later. If the barley grain was still closed with the grain covered by the husk, the priest would announce that they would have to wait another month before Passover could be observed lawfully. In such a case, a 13th month would be added to the previous year rather than starting the new year with that month. Lunar months are only 29 and a half days long, so 12 lunar months only covered 354 days. Thus, in order to keep pace with the seasons and the solar cycles, the Hebrews would add a reset month every 2 or 3 years. The earing of the barley determined whether that month was to be a 13th reset month or the first month of the new year. And this was also important because it retained the symbolism of Israel's feast days. Passover signified the death of the Lamb and had prophetic reference to the crucifixion of the Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. The wave sheaf offering signified resurrection from the dead, for on this day Jesus was raised. Thus the people could not lawfully observe the Passover unless the barley was eared out, for this signified newness of life. Jesus presented himself before his Father in the heavenly temple at the time the priest waved the barley sheaf in the earthly temple. The waving motion up and down signified resurrection. Though Jesus had actually been raised from the dead very early in the morning, he did not allow Mary to touch him prior to the wave sheaf offering. Not until the wave sheaf offering was Jesus declared legally alive in the court of heaven. When God was dealing with Pharaoh to allow Israel to leave, he sent the 10 plagues upon Egypt. The 7th plague was that of the hail, which destroyed the barley and flax, but not the wheat and spelt. And this too took place just prior to the Passover, which took place within the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. The barley was ripe and eared out just prior to that first Passover, but the wheat was not yet ripe. When Israel was ready to cross the Jordan, Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho. It was the time of Passover, and Rahab hid the spies under stalks of flax. Flax ripened in the same time as barley, as we saw from Exodus 9:31, and linen comes from flax, used to make the priestly garments. And in Revelation 19:8, we see that fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. The Hebrew word bar, or grain, may possibly be the root of our modern word for barley, but bar also has some other meanings. It means a son, in the sense of an heir. For example, Barabbas means son of the father, and Barnabas means son of consolation. Barley thus signifies the overcomers, who are known also as the sons of God. This term is used of Israel in Hosea 1:10 because of the prophet pictures Israel as being seed scattered in the field, the world, who ultimately would bring forth a great harvest of sons. Now it's interesting that Simon Peter was known on his burial box as Simon Bar-Jonah, or Yonah. That means he was the son of Jonah. Was he a descendant of Jonah? And he had that vision of the great sheet right there at the port of Jaffa, where Jonah sailed off to Nineveh and got swallowed by the whale. So get this, Jesus is the Passover lamb. The flax is harvested at the time of Passover, and linen is made from it. So it's very interesting when Jesus was the Passover lamb. In Revelation 1:14, you have that verse that says, and I love this because this is when I was reading this is when both of my chimes started, the clapper inside both chime sets started going around, and there was no wind. And I was reading this kind of under my breath out loud. And that's what happened. It says, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. So anyway, he's wearing linen, white linen, pure. And that is the time of the flax harvest, which is at the same time as the barley harvest. Of course, in Mark 15:46, we see that Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body of Jesus and wrapped it in the linen and placed it in the tomb cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone in front of the door. Therefore, the linen fabric that was made from the harvested flax was used for his burial shroud. And I have a lot of things about this in my book that are just absolutely stunning and amazing. So I hope that you'll get a copy and read that, because it's really extraordinary. You see in Revelation 1:13, and in the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet and girded about the chest with a golden band. So the Messiah in heaven is dressed in the pure white linen. Now take this into account that the linen is harvested at the same time, around the same time frame, as the barley. And in Revelation 7:9, this is where we see this verse. After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. So at the time they are wearing these white linen robes as they're standing before the throne of the Lamb. And when did Jesus become the Passover lamb? Was at the Passover season, at the time of the flax being harvested for the linen, and at the time of the barley harvest, when the grain was coming into being fully ripe and harvested. So putting those two harvests together at the time of Passover is very interesting, because we had the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of those who came up out of their graves at the time that he did, and they were seen walking around in the city. And that's the time people, arose from death to life. That's when Jesus came out of the grave. And now he's dressed in the white linen, and his hair is white like wool and white like snow. And then you have this multitude that no one could count from all the nations standing there before the Lamb, the Passover lamb, and they're all wearing the white linen. Don't you think this is an extraordinary connection? Because I just think that God was telling me to look at when the barley harvest happens in Egypt as opposed to being in Israel. If it coincides, that's one thing. But it may be a little bit different in Egypt. And that's when God told them, while they were in Egypt, that they were going to leave. They were not in the promised land yet, by any stretch of the imagination. So we can't go by the barley harvest as it is in Israel. It has to be when it is in Egypt. Don't you think? Just ponder these things. They're extraordinary. And I don't want to make this video way too long. So I'm just going to sign out and let you ponder about the resurrection rapture event, and that the saints are clothed in white robes. And that whole harvest of the barley and the flax has to do with the linen and the grain that's harvested, representing, I believe, the church is represented by the barley. And what's fascinating is there's references to Israel being the wheat. And he says he will gather his wheat into his barn. When considering wheat, which is a harvest that comes later, listen to this verse in Jeremiah 51:33. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor. It is time to thresh her. Yet a little while, and the time of her harvest shall come. One of the versions of this says, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Babylon is like wheat on a threshing floor. So let me just tell you that there's a difference in the wheat that's grown and that's been genetically modified from today, which is why when you buy bread, you're not getting nutritional value. You are to some degree with certain things they add to it, but it had a reason why it was a staple, and people with diabetes can't keep bread in their diet. Let me just tell you that the prototype of the ancient wheat, called Hakita, the mother wheat, was first found in 1906 by Aaron Aronson in Rosh Pina, northeast Israel. American and Israeli researchers have found in it a gene that is missing from today's wheat. This gene made the ancient wheat richer in protein, zinc, and iron. So that's why it was a staple and people could survive on it. So it's interesting that God said that about Babylon, and yet Israel is often known as the wheat of God. And there you have the wheat and the tares, the mystery Babylon the Great, and you would have God's harvest Israel, which all Israel will be saved. So you have the separation of the wheat and the tares. And to me that seems like that harvest of the separation of the wheat and the tares has to do with Israel and mystery Babylon in the last days. Now I'm not going to continue talking about the wheat harvest because it comes after the barley harvest. And the most important thing in this video that I'm telling you is that I made this realization that we should be looking at when Aviv happens in Egypt instead of looking at when it happens in Israel. So that connection, and then also the fact that the linen is the flax in blossom, ready to be harvested at the time of Passover, at the time of the month of Aviv, which is now NISAN. So very interesting that the resurrection of Jesus and these other people happened at the time of those two things. And you have the multitude dressed in the white linen, for this is the righteousness of the saints. Could that be the time of the rapture, resurrection of the dead, when we meet the Lord in the air in the glory cloud? It's a very interesting thing to ponder, and I hope that you liked this video and that you'll support it. And I just wanted to share this with you because I thought it was really extraordinary information to add to that observation of that month of Nisan, the month of Passover, and what the Lord said in Exodus and in Deuteronomy about it, that John mentioned on Watchmen for that Great Day. So other people have mentioned it too. I saw a bunch of videos about that very verse referring to observing it. So anyway, this is very interesting. And remember that the very night that Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, I told you that was the night that even the Jewish people say is the night of watching for the redemption. There was a specific night of watching for the redemption, and that was the night after they partook of the Passover meal. They went out to the Garden of Gethsemane singing the Hallel. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus repeatedly told the disciples, couldn't you just watch 1 hour? Couldn't you just watch? On the very night that the Jews know is the night to be watching for the redemption. And so here was the redemption about to happen, and they couldn't even watch. So is that the night we are specified to be watching for the Lord to descend from heaven with a shout? It's a possibility, and I'm throwing it out there because I think these things are kind of just unraveling as we go. And, well, as well as the book of Daniel being opened and showing people what's happening. Anyway, I had that in another video, so you might want to go watch that one. Watch, therefore. So, this is very interesting. And a bride always wears white, usually, if it's her first wedding. So, that would be, coinciding with wearing the linen clothes by the multitude that are pure and white. The bride has made herself ready. So think about it. What do you think? I hope it blessed you a lot.